They tell you to believe in justice, that Ukraine is the victim, Russia is the aggressor, and the West is the guardian of peace. But if it were truly that simple, why has the war dragged on into its third year, with hundreds of thousands dead, and still no end in sight? In this video, I'm not here to tell you which side to choose. I only invite you to take a deeper look at the entire Ukraine war, from what started in Maidan Square to the geopolitical chess game between Russia, the US, and NATO, and especially from the eyes of ordinary people trapped between political slogans. We'll go through 8 chapters, each a slice of the truth, and then you'll decide for yourself. Chapter 1. From the Maidan Revolution to Russia's invasion, the roots are not so simple. When a war breaks out, we're often told one side is evil, the other is righteous. But if you've heard about Iraq, about Syria, about Libya, you'll understand the truth often lies somewhere in the middle and is hidden very carefully. In February 2022, Russia officially launched a military operation in Ukraine. The West immediately condemned it as an invasion. Headlines, images, and slogans flooded the media, painting the war as a battle between light and darkness, Ukraine as the helpless victim, and Russia as the mad empire builder. But to understand what's really going on, we need to go back to 2014, or even earlier. Maidan, revolution or coup? In February 2014, Ukraine's then-president Viktor Yanukovych, a pro-Russian figure, was overthrown after weeks of protests at Kiev's Maidan Square. The protests began when he refused to sign a trade agreement with the EU, a decision many Ukrainians saw as betraying their dream of European integration. The West called it a democratic revolution, but Russia and many neutral analysts called it a coup backed by the West. One of the most controversial pieces of evidence was a leaked phone call between Victoria Nuland, then U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, and the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. In the recording, they openly discussed who should be in Ukraine's next government after Yanukovych was removed. Nuland even infamously said, "FK the EU," a sign that the U.S. wanted to take charge, regardless of Europe's input. A new government was installed. Pro-Russian parties were sidelined, the Russian language was restricted, and unrest began to stir in eastern regions, home to many ethnic Russians. Crimea annexation or referendum? Right after Maidan, Russia sent troops into Crimea, home to the Black Sea Fleet and a predominantly Russian-speaking population. A referendum was held. The result, according to Russia, showed that over 90% of Crimeans wanted to join Russia. The West called it an illegal occupation, but Russia argued they were doing what the U.S. had done in Kosovo, supporting a separatist region breaking away from its central government when its people no longer felt safe. The truth is, many Crimeans had protested in favor of Russia. They did not feel represented by the new Maidan-installed government. And more importantly, Russia could not afford to lose Crimea, its only strategic naval base on the Black Sea. Donbass, a civil war or intervention? In eastern Ukraine, particularly the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, pro-Russian separatists also declared independence. A low-intensity war broke out between Ukrainian government forces and the separatists, lasting from 2014 to 2022, killing over 14,000 people, mostly civilians. The West called it a rebellion backed by Russia. Russia called it a legitimate uprising of Russian-speaking people. Both sides signed the Minsk I and II agreements to establish a ceasefire, but the terms were violated repeatedly by both. In 2022, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel even admitted in an interview that the Minsk agreements were meant to give Ukraine time to rearm, a statement Russia took as confirmation they had been deceived, step by step, toward war. From 2014 to 2022, Ukraine received tens of billions of dollars in military aid from the West. NATO military advisors became more common, and large-scale joint exercises were held near Russia's border. By 2021, Ukraine officially declared its desire to join NATO, a move Russia saw as its ultimate red line. In February 2022, after Ukraine refused to pledge neutrality, and after Russia recognized the two republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, Putin gave the order to invade. That was the day the world was stunned. But that shock, at least in part, came from the fact that people had chosen to ignore what happened since 2014. Wars never erupt in a single day. They are fed by decisions, schemes, and deceptions that stretch over a decade. Maidan was the spark, but that spark could never have caused an explosion without an external catalyst. And that catalyst was NATO. Chapter 2. Who pushed Ukraine into war? NATO's dangerous nod. In every conflict, the question isn't just who fired the first shot, but who handed them the gun. And more importantly, who created the conditions that made war inevitable. In February 2022, Russia officially launched a military operation in Ukraine. The West called it a blatant invasion. But what they rarely mention is the shadow of NATO and the broken promises made 30 years earlier. When an unwritten promise is still a promise. In 1990 to 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing and Germany was preparing to reunify, the West, especially the US, made verbal commitments to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. NATO would not expand eastward if Russia allowed East Germany to join the West. These promises were never put into writing, but they were documented in numerous memos, letters, diaries, and even acknowledged by Western diplomats at the time. U.S. Secretary of State James Baker once told Gorbachev that NATO would not move an inch to the east. So what happened next? NATO moves right to Russia's doorstep. From 1999 to 2020, NATO expanded aggressively, admitting 14 Eastern European countries, including Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, and even former Soviet republics. In 2008, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, the U.S. declared support for Ukraine and Georgia to eventually join NATO. Russia reacted furiously, calling it a hostile provocation. That same year, war broke out in Georgia, when Russia invaded after Georgia attempted to retake South Ossetia. A similar scenario would later play out in Ukraine. Ukraine from buffer zone to frontline. For decades, Ukraine maintained a soft neutrality, balancing ties with both Russia and the West. But after the Maidan events in 2014, Ukraine leaned decisively westward, signing trade deals with the EU, reforming its military along NATO standards, and holding frequent joint exercises. By 2021 to 2022, President Volodymyr Zelensky announced Ukraine would push to join NATO as fast as possible. For Moscow, this was no longer just a diplomatic issue. It was an existential threat. NATO membership for Ukraine would mean Western troops and weapons positioned right next to Russia's border, just a few hundred kilometers from Moscow. Would the U.S. tolerate the same? Imagine this. If China or Russia formed a military alliance and stationed missiles in Mexico or Cuba, would the U.S. stay quiet? History answered that question in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, the U.S. nearly launched a nuclear war, backing off only after the USSR agreed to remove the missiles. To Russia, Ukraine is that Cuba, but on its doorstep. Russia's warnings were long and loud. For over a decade before 2022, Russian leaders repeatedly warned that Ukraine joining NATO was a red line they would not tolerate. Even some Western scholars and diplomats warned of the consequences. George Kennan, the architect of the U.S. Cold War containment policy, called NATO expansion the most fateful error of American policy in the post-Cold War era. Henry Kissinger, Noam Chomsky, and John Mearsheimer echoed the same warning. Pushing NATO to Russia's doorstep would trigger a response the West couldn't control, but those warnings were ignored. And so war broke out. When the West continued to push NATO expansion and Ukraine declared its intent to reclaim Crimea by force, Russia took it as a declaration of war. On February 21, 2022, Putin recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. 3 days later, on February 24, Russian forces crossed the border, launching a brutal war that continues to this day. You may not like Putin. You may hate war, but one thing you can't deny: the West knew exactly what this would cost and marched forward anyway. The question is why? Chapter 3, The Information Battlefield. When both the West and Russia twist the truth, They tell you to pick a side, but what they don't tell you is both sides want to control your mind before they control the battlefield. The war in Ukraine isn't just being fought on the ground, it's also a brutal war of information. A war where the truth isn't distorted by one side, but by all sides. And the biggest losers? Not the soldiers, but the ordinary people, those who just want to know what's really happening. The West selecting truth like its ammunition. From the early days of the war, Western media flooded the headlines with stories like, Russia will run out of missiles in 2 weeks. Ukraine retakes 20 villages in a single night. Putin is dying. Kremlin infighting escalates. Russia is using World War II-era weapons. But just weeks later, those headlines disappeared without a single correction. The truth is, more than 2 years into the war, Russia continues to produce missiles, artillery, and modern weapons at even higher rates than before, thanks to a fully restructured defense industry. Likewise, lightning counteroffensives were splashed across front pages with flashy visuals, while their failures were buried beneath the weather reports. The media doesn't lie. They just carefully select what they want you to see. Russia, a propaganda empire just as dangerous. Russia is no better. State channels like RT, Sputnik, and pro-Kremlin military sources repeat the same narratives. We are not invading, we're liberating. Ukraine's government is fascist. Donbass is facing genocide. The special operation will be over in days. NATO is Satan. Ukraine is America's puppet. Russia blocks Facebook, Instagram, BBC, DW, and labels all foreign media as hostile propaganda tools. Anyone questioning the war risks jail time for defaming the military. In the Kremlin's world, there are no casualties, no failures, only a stable process. Psychological warfare, manipulating the masses through emotion. Both sides understand one thing well. People don't react to facts. They react to feelings. The West shows a Ukrainian child hugging a cat, fleeing the bombs, a grandmother crying in a basement. Russia counters with videos of Donetsk civilians shelled by Kiev's forces, a mother screaming beside her child's body. These images spread like wildfire, and each side becomes certain that they are the true victims. No one stops to ask, could both sides be suffering? When emotion overpowers reason, truth always loses. Why aren't you told the truth? Major news outlets, whether CNN or RT, all have agendas. They serve the state, corporations, or ideologies behind them. Western reporters are often restricted from frontline access, only allowed to report what the Ukrainian military tells them. Independent YouTubers and journalists like The Gray Zone, Seymour Hersh, Scott Ritter are labeled conspiracy theorists, demonetized, or outright banned. When information is censored, curated, or distorted, viewers are left with two options: either believe one side entirely or start searching and questioning for themselves. Where do you stand in this information war? Have you ever asked yourself, why does the West never report on Ukrainian soldiers defecting? Why is Ukraine's casualty count kept so vague and secretive? Why is a failed counteroffensive called a symbolic victory? And why do you only see Russia's ugliness, but not the flaws inside Ukraine's own leadership? When both sides twist the truth, the wisest choice is not to take sides, but to take the side of truth, even when it makes you uncomfortable. Chapter 4. The 2023 Summer Counteroffensive, Broken Hopes and the West's Deafening Silence. They promised this counteroffensive would be the turning point, but when the battlefield dust settled, the only turning point was the suffocating silence from the very voices that once cheered the loudest. In the summer of 2023, after over a year of holding the line, the Ukrainian government, backed massively by the US and Europe, announced a major counteroffensive to retake southern territory, especially the Zaporizhzhia region and the land corridor connecting Russia to Crimea. The West was jubilant. Media declared it Ukraine's last chance to win. Billions of dollars in weapons poured in: German Leopard tanks, US M777 howitzers, long-range HIMARS missiles, and elite NATO training. News headlines blazed with optimism. Ukraine was ready to change the course of the war. And then, reality on the battlefield turned out to be very different. Progress like a turtle, but media like a missile. The counteroffensive began in June 2023. In the first days, Ukraine lost hundreds of armored vehicles. Dozens of Western-supplied machines were destroyed within hours as they entered areas fortified by Russian mines, barriers, and suicide drones. By late August, the New York Times admitted Ukraine had advanced only a few kilometers in nearly 3 months, at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties. Yet strangely, that same paper had previously run headlines like, Ukraine breaks through first Russian line, victory within reach. No one was held accountable for the contradiction. They just quietly changed the tone. The problem wasn't bravery, it was terrain and tactics. Ukraine lacked neither courage nor will to fight, but they faced a defense system that Russia had built for over 9 months. Vast minefields, dragon's teeth barriers, anti-tank trenches, layered artillery zones, and defensive drones. Western tanks, designed for high-speed warfare in Europe, got bogged down in minefields, becoming easy targets for Russian drones and precise artillery. Ukraine lacked air superiority. They had no overwhelming artillery advantage, and no time to prepare a full-scale ground campaign like the West once did in Iraq or Libya. Western weapons, not magic wands. Many had believed German Leopards, U.S. Bradleys, or HIMARS would shift the war's balance. But modern warfare, especially against a military like Russia's, isn't like a flashy YouTube weapons ad. Russia used Lancet and Orlan drones en masse to locate and strike targets. Ukrainian troops operated with little air defense, weak electronic jamming, and zero air dominance. The problem wasn't weak weapons, it was lack of support systems, strategy distorted by political pressure, and a timeline too rushed to plan a large-scale operation. Then came the silence. When the counteroffensive failed to meet expectations, the West quietly changed the subject. News reports shifted toward Israel-Hamas conflict, U.S. elections, and climate change. No one mentioned Zaporizhia anymore. No one asked what happened to the thousands of Ukrainian lives lost in the minefields. Instead of admitting a failed strategy, they changed the narrative. Ukraine needs more weapons, Russia is collapsing, Putin is isolated. So why push Ukraine to counterattack? There's one theory worth considering. The West didn't believe Ukraine could win, but didn't want Ukraine to lose too soon either. So they kept the aid just enough for Ukraine to keep fighting, but never enough to decisively win. Some analysts call it a strategy to bleed Russia with Ukrainian lives. A proxy war where the real pain isn't in Brussels or Washington, but in Kharkiv, Bakhmut, and the field hospitals far behind the lines. The 2023 summer counteroffensive was a turning point, but not on the battlefield. It was a turning point in how people began to realize not everyone who promises to help truly wants you to win. Chapter 5, the numbers no one dares to publish? Who's really losing more? One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths a statistic, and when war drags on, numbers become tools, used to paint victories or hide defeats. More than 2 years since the Ukraine war began, neither side has dared to release an official, reliable, independently verified death toll. Not because the numbers don't exist, but because the truth is too brutal to admit and too dangerous to reveal. Russia losing more than they admit. From the very first months, Russia's Ministry of Defense declared, "Our losses are minimal. The operation is proceeding as planned." Since then, Russia has remained almost entirely silent on casualties. Western estimates suggest, by early 2024, Russia may have suffered over 400,000 total casualties, including more than 100,000 killed. But there's no hard evidence, no independent reports, just intelligence assessments. Russia denies these figures. They claim the West is exaggerating and that the real death toll is around 50,000 to 70,000. The question is, if Russia really had such heavy losses, how are they still attacking on multiple fronts, mobilizing 400,000 new troops annually, and producing hundreds of thousands of shells each month? The truth may lie somewhere in the middle, but no one can say for sure. Ukraine, losses hidden even more than weapons. Since mid-2022, Ukraine has almost entirely stopped reporting its own casualty figures. President Zelensky and government officials routinely say, this information is a military secret, but leaked numbers from Western sources paint a chilling picture. The Economist estimated that by the end of 2023, Ukraine may have lost over 200,000 soldiers, including killed, severely wounded, or missing. Seymour Hersh, a veteran investigative journalist, stated that the real number far exceeds what the public knows. Independent researchers have compiled funeral lists, videos of grieving families, and satellite images of cemeteries expanding weekly, arriving at similar estimates, at least 150,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed. And while the West continues blaming Russia, what Ukrainian families really want to know is, why is the fate of their sons being hidden? Media avoids the reality. Have you noticed? There are no major investigative reports by CNN or BBC on the Ukrainian military's death toll. No interviews with Ukrainian mothers protesting for transparency. No news about the constant expansion of cemeteries in Lviv, Dnipro, or Vinnytsia. Instead, Western media focuses on heroic fighting spirit, symbolic victories, and highlights Russian losses, as if to reassure the public that everything is under control. Conflicting numbers lost in dangerous consequences. Why do both sides avoid revealing the real casualty figures? Because society can't handle the truth. If the Russian public knew hundreds of thousands of soldiers had died, would support for Putin remain? If Ukrainians knew the true toll, morale could collapse, especially as they watched the West shift its attention to their own elections. In war, information is a weapon, and casualty numbers, when unverified, are just propaganda tools. Whoever controls public emotion temporarily controls the narrative. Who should we believe? Believe Russia? You can't. They tightly control their media and suppress dissenting voices. Believe the West? That's tough too. They have political reasons to downplay failures, boost aid, and keep public support. So what's left? Look at the things that can't be hidden. Cemeteries expanding every week. Soldiers growing younger and older. Signs that reserves are running dry. Ukrainian mothers screaming outside draft offices. And viral videos, quickly deleted, but still leaving behind traces of a truth someone tried to bury. When both sides fear the truth, you know that truth holds enormous power. And maybe that's exactly why they don't want you to see it. Chapter 6, Ukrainians, fighting by choice or because there's no other option? It's easy to say we'll fight to the last man when you're not that man. Since the war began, Western media have repeatedly praised Ukrainians as model resistance fighters, willing to sacrifice for independence, determined to push back Russia, and refusing to surrender to violence. But if you look deeper into life inside Ukraine, especially from 2023 onward, you'll see a different picture. Exhaustion, panic, and countless people who no longer want to fight, yet have no way out. Forced conscription videos spread across social media. Since mid-2023, numerous videos have circulated on Telegram, TikTok, and independent channels, showing Ukrainian draft officers surrounding young men on the streets and forcing them to sign enlistment papers. Some were seized while shopping, others pulled from buses. One viral clip showed a man being dragged into a van during his lunch break. At first, the Ukrainian government stayed silent. Later, it admitted that some recruiting centers violated procedure, but denied any systematic abuse. In reality, forced conscription has become increasingly common, especially in places like Odessa, Kharkiv, and Western Ukraine, regions once considered peaceful rear zones. A manpower crisis, signs of a nation running dry. In early 2024, Ukraine announced it would lower the draft age from 27 to 25 and mobilize more than 500,000 new soldiers. This sparked fierce backlash from the public. Thousands of Ukrainian men fled the country through Romania, Slovakia, and especially Moldova. Some were caught crossing rivers. Others paid tens of thousands of dollars for illegal help to escape the country. There is a silent wave, ignored by Western media, of Ukrainians who do not want to die in this war, especially those who no longer trust their leadership and feel that the West is offering only calculated aid, not truly sharing the burden of blood. Old soldiers, young recruits, everyone pushed to the front. In 2023 and 2024, videos emerged of older men, some over 50 or even 60 years old, receiving minimal training before being sent to the front lines. At the same time, More and more 18-year-old boys were being drafted with no proper training, then deployed to frontline units, where death rates are extremely high. As reserves run dry, Ukraine has no choice but to widen conscription. But that also means society itself is beginning to wear down. Military pay, not enough to silence the fear. Some Ukrainians don't want to enlist, but accept it due to financial pressure and family responsibilities. Military pay, though modest, is still a steady income amid economic collapse. But money doesn't erase the feeling of abandonment. Many soldiers report a lack of gear, scarce food, and, most of all, a lack of trust in leadership. Some units even fundraise on their own to buy UAVs, body armor, and essential supplies, just to survive. This is no longer an army fighting for ideals. It's people struggling to stay alive in a war machine that's falling apart. Society's response: silence from fear. Any voice of dissent is labeled unpatriotic. Independent media in Ukraine is almost fully controlled. Many journalists, bloggers, and YouTubers have faced legal attacks or threats for questioning the war's strategy or conscription policies. Even Ukrainian mothers, those who lost sons or whose children went missing, have been banned from protesting or harassed when demanding accountability from the government. Why do they fight? Some fight out of patriotism, some out of grief, some because they have nowhere else to go, and some only want to protect the friends beside them, not because they believe in any flag anymore. Not everyone holding a gun is a hero. Sometimes they're just people with no other choice, and in war sometimes just surviving is the quietest form of resistance. Chapter 7, the US and NATO aid to help or to let Ukraine fight their war. They call it helping a democratic nation. But if that's truly the case, why don't they fight alongside Ukraine, instead of just sending weapons from a distance? As of early 2024, the total value of Western aid to Ukraine has surpassed $200 billion. The United States alone has spent over $75 billion, including hundreds of tanks, long-range artillery, air defense systems, millions of rounds of ammunition, and several covert training programs. Looking at the numbers alone, one might think the West is going all in for a noble cause. But look more closely, and a deeper question emerges. Is this aid truly to help Ukraine win, or to keep Ukraine fighting a war the West refuses to fight themselves? Strong declarations, weak actions. Since day one of the war, Western leaders, from Biden to Macron, from Ursula von der Leyen to Stoltenberg, have repeated the same message. Ukraine must win. We will stand with them. But what does standing with them really mean? They don't send troops. They don't provide modern air power. They send aid in small packages, often delayed, blocked by legislatures, or tied up by internal disagreements. When Ukraine needs F-16s, they say, "We need time to train pilots." When Ukraine runs out of shells, they reply, "Production is underway, please wait." And as Ukrainian soldiers die every day, the West debates how much more to send, just enough to maintain the balance, but never enough for victory. A proxy war, a term everyone understands but no one says aloud. It's no coincidence that many scholars call this the largest proxy war since the Cold War. The US doesn't risk its own soldiers. NATO avoids nuclear retaliation from Russia. Yet they manage to weaken Russia, prolong the conflict, and drain Moscow's resources by giving Ukraine just enough to keep fighting, but not enough to win decisively. Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger once warned, dragging out this war to weaken Russia will ultimately sacrifice Ukraine the most. But that warning was ignored. Where does the aid actually go? A significant portion of Western aid never reaches the front lines. Numerous reports suggest weapons are being illegally sold, lost, or left idle due to missing spare parts. Corruption exists within the Ukrainian military and government, especially in contracts for equipment and supplies. Some Western-supplied drones and armored vehicles have been captured intact by Russia, becoming valuable prizes for reverse engineering. Despite U.S. demands for strict oversight, in the chaos of war, who really controls anything? The U.S., humanitarian help, or geopolitical investment? Ukraine isn't just a nation under attack. It's also a geopolitical chess piece in a broader strategic game. If Ukraine wins, the West gains a new ally against Russia and opens a pathway into Central Asia. If Russia gets bogged down, its global influence shrinks, and China feels the ripple effect. The U.S. can test weapons, refine tactics, and gather intelligence without risking a single American life. And most importantly, Western defense contractors are earning record profits from massive new arms production contracts, thanks to this war. Do Ukrainians know who they're fighting for? Some Ukrainians, especially among the political elite, truly believe they are defending European civilization. But in rural areas, where sons are conscripted and homes destroyed, people are beginning to ask, why won't the West fight with us? Why doesn't the aid come with a peace roadmap? Why has the life of a Ukrainian become just another bargaining chip in someone else's geopolitical game? A true friend stands beside you when you're attacked. A calculating ally sends weapons and watches you bleed, from a safe distance until you're no longer worth the investment. Chapter 8, The Endgame. Is peace what anyone really wants? As the war drags into its third year, the question is no longer, who's winning, but rather, does anyone actually want it to end? From mid-2023 to early 2025, the war in Ukraine has largely reached a stalemate. Neither side has achieved a decisive victory. Russia continues to control most of Donbass and the land corridor to Crimea. Ukraine, despite massive Western aid, has been unable to reclaim lost territories. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands have died, millions have become refugees, Ukraine's economy is devastated, and Russian society is increasingly isolated and authoritarian. Amid this bleak landscape, many are starting to ask, why isn't there peace? Why no negotiations? Could it be that the war continues not because it can't end, but because it serves too many interests? Does Russia want to end the war? From Russia's side, the initial goals were to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. But after 3 years, the objectives seem to have shifted. Maintain control over seized territories, secure the land bridge to Crimea, and ensure Ukraine never joins NATO. To achieve this through diplomacy, Russia would need a Ukrainian government willing to accept unfavorable terms, a scenario that's nearly impossible today. So what about continuing the fight? Russia holds advantages in manpower, defense industry capacity, and energy resources. They believe time is on their side and that the West will grow tired first. Does Ukraine want peace? On the Ukrainian side, President Zelensky's administration is adamant. Not a single inch of land will be surrendered. He even signed a decree forbidding negotiations with Putin and stated that peace will only be accepted if Russia withdraws completely and returns Crimea. But in reality, that outcome is unthinkable. Russia has no reason to retreat after spilling so much blood and spending so many resources. And by taking such a hardline stance, Ukraine has effectively locked itself out of negotiations, even as its losses mount. The West is seeking victory or just prolonging the war? The US and Europe keep repeating, we will support Ukraine until the end. But what does the end mean? They send no troops. They restrict long-range weapon deliveries. They provide aid in small batches. Too little for a breakthrough, just enough to keep going. Some analysts call this a managed war strategy, enough to prevent Ukraine from losing, but not enough to let it win. Why? Because if Ukraine wins, the next question becomes, who will rebuild the country? Who will take on the fallout of a full Russia-NATO confrontation? And if Ukraine loses too quickly, the West risks a geopolitical embarrassment. So prolonging the war becomes a politically safe choice, even if it's bloody and costly for Ukrainians. What endgame scenarios are possible? Right now, 3 scenarios are most commonly discussed. 1. Permanent partition. Ukraine loses Donbass and Crimea in exchange for peace and Western reconstruction aid. But this would be seen as political defeat, unacceptable for both Kiev and the West. 2. Partial negotiated settlement. Both sides agree to a ceasefire, establish a demilitarized zone, and begin long-term negotiations, similar to the North-South Korea model. This cold peace could last for years. 3rd, escalated war. If the West increases long-range weapons aid and Russia responds by expanding mobilization, the conflict could spiral into a direct Russia-NATO confrontation, a scenario no one wants, but no one can fully rule out either. And meanwhile, ordinary people remain trapped. Ukrainians are losing their homes, families, and futures. Russians are dying quietly, under censorship and thousands of Western sanctions. Europeans face soaring energy prices, inflation, and political instability. And Americans? They're gearing up for another election cycle, one that could completely reverse U.S. policy on Ukraine. The war isn't over. It may drag on for many more years, but when we look at the full picture, from the roots of the conflict, the hidden casualty numbers, to the real role of the superpowers, perhaps we no longer believe this is simply a battle of good versus evil. Maybe the truth is too complex, and that's exactly why they don't want you to understand it. I don't stand with any side. I stand with the truth, with the people, and with those paying the real price, not with statements made on television, but with blood. And what about you? Do you think peace is still possible? Who do you believe holds the greatest responsibility for prolonging the war? If you were Ukraine's leader, what would you do differently? If you were a Western citizen, would you be willing to pay more taxes to continue funding this war? And if you were Ukrainian, would you accept losing territory in exchange for a ceasefire? Share your thoughts in the comments. We value every opinion, even if you disagree, because truth, freedom, and peace are never born from silence. If you found this video thought-provoking, please like, share, and leave your own comment. Do you agree with my analysis, or do you see it differently? This channel is for those who refuse to be led blindly. If that's you, hit subscribe and join me on the next journey to uncover deeper truths.